On a day meant to seal two families together, the entire ceremony collapsed in seconds. The bride stood at the altar in her $40,000 gown, chest rising and falling as if the air had turned to ice. Guests went silent halfway through their applause, staring at the dirt-stained girl who had stumbled into the aisle. Her arms were bruised, her voice cracking as she cried, "I just want to talk to my father." The bride didn't hesitate. She marched straight toward her, shoving her hard enough to make her fall, tearing the girl's already ripped dress as she yelled for security. And while the room gasped, the groom froze, color draining from his face like he'd just seen a ghost from a life he'd tried to forget. The girl pushed herself up, shaking, tears streaking through the mud on her cheeks, and screamed, "Ask him about the night I disappeared!" In that moment, every vow, every smile, every promise made that morning felt suddenly fragile. How did all of this explode at the very heart of a wedding? Why did the bride react with such rage? And what truth was she terrified would come out in front of everyone? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a wedding fell apart in front of hundreds of people, we have to go back to the beginning and meet the people whose lives were tied to that single explosive moment. Jonathan Hale was the kind of man newspapers called unstoppable, a Texas real estate powerhouse who built empires the way other men built fences, with sheer force and the belief that nothing could stand in his way. Yet behind the business headlines, he carried a quiet grief that never left him, because years earlier his daughter Amaya vanished at just 11 years old, a disappearance that shattered his first marriage and drained every ounce of softness he once had. His new bride, Evelyn Hale, came from a political dynasty that treated image like oxygen. She was refined, poised, careful with every word she ever spoke, and determined that nothing, absolutely nothing, would stain the picture-perfect life she had planned. And then there was Amaya, the little girl the world assumed was gone forever after her case went cold, her photos fading from bulletin boards and news segments as months turned into years, even though her father never truly accepted the idea of letting her memory rest. Everyone involved carried stakes that reached far deeper than any wedding vow. Jonathan's loss had turned him into a man who would do anything to keep his family from collapsing again. Evelyn had spent her entire life avoiding scandals tied to her family's political name, and reopening a cold kidnapping case could destroy everything she worked to build. The disappearance of Amaya had become a shadow hovering over every decision they made, a story with pages torn out and questions no one wanted to revisit. But there was something the public never knew about the kidnapping, something that would make the moment at the wedding far more devastating than anyone imagined. On Amaya's final day before she disappeared, the Hale estate carried a strange mixture of warmth and quiet unease. Jonathan was leaving early for a meeting, promising his daughter they would finish their backyard treehouse that weekend, while his mother lingered a little longer than usual at the breakfast table, watching Amaya hum as she braided her hair. She couldn't explain it, but something felt off, an instinct she tried to ignore until she noticed a black SUV parked farther down the road, its tinted windows unmoving. Later that afternoon, as Amaya played in the garden, her mother spotted a woman she didn't recognize standing near the property line, pretending to check her phone but glancing at the house every few seconds. When she rushed outside to confront her, the woman turned and disappeared behind the trees, leaving only questions and a rising chill that pushed against every part of her intuition. The moment Amaya vanished began with something as ordinary as a mother turning away for a few seconds. She stepped inside to grab sunscreen, calling out that she'd be right back, but when she returned, a sharp scream cut through the garden, followed by a silence so heavy it made her knees buckle. The back gate stood slightly open, a gate that was always locked, and in the grass lay Amaya's bracelet, the one she refused to leave the house without. Her mother's cries carried across the yard as she searched every corner, shouting her daughter's name until her voice cracked. By the time security swept the grounds and Jonathan rushed home, the estate had transformed from a safe haven into a maze of flashing lights, frantic officers, and neighbors gathering at the fence, whispering as if tragedy had become something they expected from people with power and money. Within hours, the investigation turned into chaos. Reporters crowded the driveway demanding answers. Police offered contradictory statements to calm the public, and the detective assigned to the case appeared more interested in managing the story than finding a missing child. False leads poured in from so-called witnesses claiming they saw Amaya everywhere, from bus stations to airports, each one distracting the search teams and draining precious time. Meanwhile, Evelyn's family quietly hired private investigators, insisting it was to help, but their involvement raised more suspicion than relief. Why were politicians so invested in a case that wasn't theirs? Why were they moving faster than law enforcement itself? The months that followed buried the Hale family in doubt, grief, and unanswered questions. But the first real clue didn't appear until much later, and it pointed to someone inside the Hale circle.
The first major turn came nearly 6 months after Amaya's disappearance, when a longtime staff member finally broke down in front of Jonathan and confessed something he had been forced to carry in silence. On the day Amaya vanished, he had seen her being pulled into the same black SUV that had been lingering near the estate. He recognized her panicked scream, saw her arms flailing, but before he could intervene, the vehicle sped off. Terrified, he reported what he witnessed to the detective in charge, only to be told to stay quiet, that he must have been mistaken, and that speaking out would damage the investigation. His guilt grew unbearable, and Jonathan realized for the first time that someone with authority had decided which truths were allowed to surface. It wasn't just a failed investigation. Something was being controlled, shaped, and buried by people who stood far above him. Soon after that revelation, another disturbing twist surfaced. Jonathan received a ransom call, shaky and distorted, demanding money in exchange for Amaya's safe return. He tried to keep the caller talking, desperate for anything that could lead to her, but before the police could trace the line, the call ended abruptly. For days he waited, pacing along the hallway near Amaya's unused bedroom, but no second call ever came. The silence that followed was more haunting than the threat itself, as if whoever contacted him had vanished into thin air. Officers insisted it was likely a hoax, yet the urgency in the caller's voice, the mention of details only family would know, it all felt too real. Jonathan couldn't shake the fear that someone was playing with him, testing his reactions, or even warning him to stop searching altogether. Not long after the ransom call, Evelyn's father inserted himself directly into the investigation. He approached Jonathan with a calmness that felt rehearsed, encouraging him to accept the likelihood that Amaya would never be found. He urged him to end the search, reminding him of the toll it was taking on both families, and hinting that it was time to move on. Jonathan was taken aback, wondering why a man with no emotional attachment to Amaya would speak so decisively about when her story should end. The pressure seemed strategic, almost as though Evelyn's father feared what might come to light if the search continued. When the political advisors around him began echoing the same sentiment, Jonathan realized he wasn't just fighting grief. He was fighting influence, reputation, and a narrative that powerful people were actively trying to control. Around that same time, Amaya's mother began receiving anonymous letters slipped under her door during the early morning hours. The envelopes were plain, stamped with no return address, and inside each one was a single message, typed in block letters: "Stop digging." Sometimes the letters arrived once a week, sometimes twice, creating a pattern that suggested someone was watching her closely enough to know exactly when she was alone. She reported the threats, but authorities dismissed them as attempts to intimidate the family, insisting they weren't credible. To her, though, the letters felt deeply personal, written by someone who knew she wouldn't let the case rest. They fueled her determination, pushing her to look where she hadn't looked before, even as fear crept into every corner of her daily life. Then came the most devastating blow. A neighbor across the street revealed that his home security camera had been angled toward the Hale property on the afternoon of Amaya's disappearance. He handed the footage over, and for a moment it seemed like the case would finally break open. But days later, the detective claimed the evidence had been accidentally erased due to a system error at the station. Jonathan didn't believe it. Neither did Amaya's mother. The footage that could have confirmed the SUV, the kidnapper, maybe even the license plate, gone. Every loss, every misstep, every conveniently timed mistake pointed to one unsettling truth. Someone was working very hard to keep the truth buried. And the only question left was this: what were they trying so hard to hide? As the months dragged on and every lead collapsed into nothing, Amaya's mother began to unravel under the weight of her own thoughts. Nights became endless stretches of pacing, replaying the final moments she saw her daughter alive, wondering if she could have prevented everything by holding her just a little longer. Sleep came in short, trembling bursts, only to be interrupted by nightmares where she heard Amaya calling her from somewhere she could never reach. The guilt consumed her, and the strain seeped into her marriage with Jonathan. He grew more distant by the day, spending long hours locked in his office, studying timelines, phone records, and maps of the surrounding area. While she grieved through tears and silence, he drowned himself in determination, clinging to the belief that he could still bring their daughter home. Their grief pulled them in opposite directions until they could barely recognize each other anymore. The division inside the family deepened when Jonathan's in-laws began whispering that the mother was to blame for not watching Amaya closely enough. They spoke in measured tones, as if presenting a logical argument rather than an accusation that tore a mother apart. Evelyn's family, meanwhile, grew increasingly concerned with shielding the Hale name from scandal. They arranged private meetings behind closed doors, meetings Jonathan was never invited to, and meetings his first wife knew were designed to twist the narrative in ways that protected reputations, not truth. Every conversation felt coded in judgment, and every suggestion they offered seemed to push the family toward accepting an ending that no parent should ever be forced to accept. The tension in the household became unbearable, stretching across dinner tables, phone calls, and the small, fragile moments where hope tried to resurface. The final blow came when the state declared Amaya legally dead. A symbolic burial was arranged to provide the family with closure, but it only deepened the wound. The coffin was empty. There was no body, no evidence, nothing but a gesture meant to help the public move on. The mother approached the gravesite trembling, unable to breathe as the minister repeated words she refused to hear. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, she collapsed, her hands digging into the soil as if she could pull her daughter back with sheer force of will. Jonathan stood frozen, watching the ceremony through the haze of a man who had been told again and again to accept something he did not believe. And while the world considered the case closed, something inside him refused to let the story end, because deep down he sensed a truth he couldn't explain to anyone. Not yet. But Amaya wasn't dead. Far from it.
32 minutes into this story's unraveling comes the moment that changes everything. At a modest youth shelter on the outskirts of Houston, a young woman walked in just after sunset, trembling as though every shadow behind her still wanted to pull her back. The staff noticed the scars first, thin lines along her wrists, deeper marks on her shoulders, and a fading bruise near her collarbone. She flinched at sudden sounds, waking from naps with sharp, desperate gasps, as if running from memories she could barely process. When asked for identification, she handed over a stolen ID belonging to a girl who had died years earlier, a detail that made the room fall silent. But what unsettled everyone most was the single name she whispered when asked who she trusted enough to call. Her voice broke, but the words were unmistakable. Jonathan Hale. The staff exchanged glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a coincidence, a delusion, or the revival of a truth that was supposed to be buried with an empty coffin. And if you're still watching this part, comment, "I'm here." Let's see who's really following the story. For the first time, the story shifts to Amaya's perspective, though much of it remains hidden. After her disappearance at 11, she was moved across state lines, kept in places designed to erase her from the world she knew. Men came and went, their conversations cryptic but terrifying, mentioning things like the election in hushed, urgent tones. They were paid to ensure she never spoke, never left, and to remind her constantly that her life depended on obedience. There was one woman who quietly protected her in those years, offering moments of kindness and hope when everything else felt cold and unforgiving. But one day, even she vanished, leaving Amaya alone once more. The turning point came when the house she was held in caught fire, flames devouring walls and memories alike. In the chaos, she ran, clutching the smallest belongings she could carry, adopting a fake identity to survive. Shelters became her refuge, anonymity her shield. She spent years piecing together a life, all the while searching for fragments of the family she had been torn from. Then one rainy afternoon, sifting through old newspaper clippings in a local library, she stumbled on the headline that had haunted her childhood, her own disappearance. The photographs staring back at her froze her blood, every detail, every familiar feature. And in that moment, she finally understood who had orchestrated the nightmare she had lived through. And that's when she realized who was behind everything. As Amaya began piecing together the fragments of her past, she discovered a truth that made her pulse quicken with both fear and resolve. Jonathan was remarrying, his name and wealth about to be showcased in a grand spectacle of power and prestige. Evelyn's family, meanwhile, had leveraged the years since Amaya's disappearance to gain even more political influence, their reach stretching into circles that controlled headlines, votes, and public perception. The wedding promised to be more than a union. It would be a media event, plastered across televisions, newspapers, and social feeds, a stage where appearances mattered more than reality. And for Amaya, for the first time in over a decade, she realized this might be the only place where anyone would truly hear her. With that in mind, she embarked on a journey that took days, traveling alone, exhausted, yet fueled by the certainty that she couldn't remain invisible any longer. Every step carried the weight of years stolen, and yet even as she approached the gates of the estate, she had no idea she was about to face something that would shake her to her core. She was not ready for what happened next. The wedding had all the trappings of perfection, chandeliers glimmering above long polished tables, floral arrangements so meticulously curated they seemed almost unreal, and a crowd of high society guests murmuring in anticipation. Evelyn rehearsed her speeches with precision, her smile flawless, her posture elegant, every word measured to convey control and poise. Jonathan moved between greeting well-wishers and checking his watch, a subtle tension in his jaw betraying the calm exterior. Security personnel lined the edges of the hall, scanning every guest and corner as if the entire day depended on their vigilance. Then the unthinkable happened. Amaya stepped into the hall, dirt-stained and trembling, every scar and shadow of the past etched on her face. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers died instantly as all attention shifted to the girl no one thought would ever return. Evelyn's face hardened into fury. She lunged, shoving Amaya, tearing at her clothing and calling security. A slap landed, followed by a shove that sent Amaya sprawling across the marble floor. Public insults followed, echoing off the walls, aimed to humiliate and silence her. Jonathan stood frozen, his body trembling, unable to reconcile the girl in front of him with the daughter he had mourned for years. And then Amaya, with a voice that cut through the chaos, repeated the words that would leave everyone reeling. "Ask him about the night I disappeared."
The chaos that followed Amaya's revelation was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, DNA tests confirmed what everyone feared and hoped at the same time. She was Jonathan's daughter. The bride, confronted with the truth in front of hundreds of witnesses, collapsed, her carefully constructed composure shattering completely. Guests pulled out phones, capturing every raw moment, every scream, every tear, while Jonathan, finally seeing the child he thought he had lost forever, broke down completely, screaming her name, shaking with a mixture of relief, grief, and disbelief. Law enforcement rushed in, taking control of the scene as the weight of years of lies began to unravel. The truth that emerged was staggering. Evelyn's father had orchestrated Amaya's kidnapping, manipulating events to protect his political ambitions, paying traffickers, threatening witnesses, destroying evidence, and spinning a web of deception that had convinced Jonathan his daughter was dead.
The arrests that followed shook the elite circles of the city, exposing Evelyn's family to a scandal that would dominate headlines for months. The bride remained in shock, realizing in that instant that she had humiliated the girl she was meant to call a stepdaughter. Jonathan finally held Amaya in his arms, feeling the years of separation in a single, suffocating embrace. What would you have done in Amaya's place? Was justice truly served, or is this only the beginning of the story? If this story hit you like it hit us, tap that like button and subscribe for more gripping real-life stories every day.